First and foremost, condolences to Lee Crewe's friends and family. A Newport dealer, David Sisman, believed the judge would buy into the fact that he had bladed a quote-unquote drunk man because David feared for his life. David also thought that if it was forthcoming that he had been outside selling Class A on the day of the M, which happened to be May 14th of 2024, then it would help with the credibility of his tale. The 21-year-old had kept a large blade on him at all times in a Rambo style, which served to protect not only himself, but his stash of Class A he sold to customers round Newport. He was concerned that he may be targeted by other criminals, other gangs and also dealers. At the time of the M, it was also said that David had only been selling Class A for roughly a month. Now when questioned why on earth was he selling drer if he already had a steady wage coming in from the family business, David could not answer that question. On the night of the murder, David had been approached by 36-year-old Lee Crewe, belligerent, animated, and a boiling pot of mixed emotions. Lee Crewe and David got into a shouting match. Lee had drew the connection that David Sisman was a dealer. Now in the conversation, the exchange, it was alleged that Lee had told David that he wanted hard food, that being white. The only issue was Lee did not have the means to pay for the Class A. Now it might not be because he didn't have any money, it could just be that he was in a drunken state and couldn't articulate his words properly. He only knew his urges and what he wanted. Now, I'm sure we've all been there, but trying to have a conversation with a drunk person when you're completely sober is one of the most infuriating things you can experience. Described by family members as funny, caring, and loved by his family and his many friends, and highly regarded in the scaffolding community, and a talented rugby player also. However, Lee Crewe had a darker side to him, which was laid bare at the trial, and that must have been hard for his family to hear. Lee was described as a person who drunk to the point of obliteration and dabbled in drug taking. He had no switch-off button, and at times, to be sober was a near impossible task. He had suffered with self-esteem issues which made him get his teeth fixed, and the urge to stay sober and not being high versus giving into destructive vices proved difficult, made that much harder by Lee's shifting mental state. So when Lee, who was for all intents and purposes an imposing figure, had approached the 21-year-old dealer, it is understandable that David was standoffish. After all, this was a specimen of a man whom was drunk and had closed the distance between himself and David. On Tuesday, May 14th of this year, David Sisman had a choice. He could have walked away and Lee would still be alive, or been a bigger person and then tried to defuse the situation. After all, it was an animated but simple conversation of a dealer talking to a man that wanted drer. However, David Sisman took things beyond the point of no return when Lee Crewe became agitated and was likely to have used bad language at David. David took those bad words to mean that he had the right to pull out a blade from his back pocket. The large blade that David had on him was a conversation ender and a life ender. This was early nighttime in May, 6 p.m. It was still daylight on a residential street in Chepstow Road in Maydee area of Newport. Now because David Sisman, whom was said to have been making sales pretty much most of the day, did not like Lee Crewe's choice of words and his demeanour and his presence, again he reacted in one swift motion by blading the 36-year-old man in the chest with so much force that the blade actually passed through the second and third ribs and then made ribbons of Lee's left lung. And the mechanical action was not meant to warn a man to back off or even hurt that person. That deadly action was meant to kill a man, to end their life. Now in court, David apologised for his actions and depriving Lee Crewe of having a wife and children and a crewster. Now David Sisman was adamant that Lee Crewe was a rolling cauldron of boastful fury, and David had to take the decisive action in order to protect his own life. It was just unfortunate that Lee Crewe had to die for this to happen. Now the only issue with the altercation was it had been captured on CCTV and when David had pulled out his blade, Lee Crewe, who was unarmed and actually retreating at the time, he posed no threat. He had not struck David at all. So while Lee Crewe had staggered a few steps before falling to the ground, David watched momentarily as Lee slowly lost his life before weighing up his options. Now David Sisman could either help and call ambulance or just flee the scene. So David Sisman, of course, chose to run away. But not only did he run away, he actually took the M item and hurled it into the River Usk. Then David chose to hide the clothes that he had been wearing and dispose of them too. Next, David then returned to his home and then turned his mobile phone off. The entire incident from start to finish lasted no more than a few seconds. These were all actions of David Sisman trying to cover up his crime. Now, in the aftermath, police and ambulance were called to the scene and they arrived and put up a cordon. Lee Crewe's mum had actually rushed to the scene also in Chepstow Road, where she reeled from the news that her only son had sadly died, and this was now an M investigation. Immediately, friends and family had fought back to Lee Crewe's last moments. Now that day, Lee had gone to work before the job being called off by midday. With hours to spare, Lee had passed the time by consuming drink and also white, Class A, large amounts. It was still in his system when this incident took place, of course. He then saw his mate Sadie Clavely, where he spent time laughing and joking and entertaining the children on the trampoline. Now, while the police launched the M investigation and began to check CCTV footage in the area of Main D Newport, David had made the 40-minute trip to Bristol, where he attempted to keep off the police's radar by going on a date of all things. Therefore, that showed he did not care that this guy had at the least seriously harmed someone and at the worst actually committed an M. He was still able to flirt, drink and talk to women. Now the judge commented that because David Sisman had used emotion and a level of force that had killed Lee Crewe, it would be acceptable to believe that the dad had actually practiced his technique. Now when arrested, David Sisman had answered no comment to all questions, even when presented with the CCTV that put him firmly at the scene of the crime. However, David Sisman, whom had no previous convictions, did admit to selling Class A. Now David was placed in handcuffs and then charged with the M, and then put on remand until his court date. And at Newport Crown Court, David's solicitor attempted to reinforce the idea of self-defence by referring to messages of Lee Crewe, which he had sent to friends in his drunken state, saying that I'm ready to jack someone. Ultimately, David Sisman also decided not to give evidence in court, and he was found guilty of the M, and he was jailed for life with a minimum term of 25 years. Lee's family was said to be beyond devastated. Does the crime match the sentence? Let me know. Stay safe.